Welcome to the second day of our International Symposium on the Czech Foreign Policy, Strengthening Resilience, Prospects and Pitfalls. Yesterday we had very interesting discussions, mainly focused on Europe and also Russia. Actually, there was a lot of talk on Russia, energy, South Korea. So the last panel yesterday linked us to Indo-Pacific, which for some of us who are researching Asia-Pacific and now Indo-Pacific is not such a novelty, but in this part of the world, it is something that has come up, especially with more, I guess, activity from India, I would say, through Raisina dialogues and also different governments changing their strategic documents and focus and relabeling everything to Indo-Pacific. For some, obviously, this is a geographical space. For some, it's a strategic area. And that's something that we'll explore today. But we'll also touch on the European Union's latest strategy on Indo-Pacific, and we'll get some insights from different countries in Asia. We will have connections from Singapore today, Japan, Australia, to get more input from where they see this particular development in our post-pandemic world. Just to quickly introduce the speakers, because I'm not here to deliver my remarks. The first speaker will be Professor Dr. Kellner, who sits next to me, and he's from Hamburg, from Germany. He's Vice President of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, kindly traveled to be here physically. And his research revolves around political organizations, institutions in different parts of Asia. I personally got to know him through articles on Australia and New Zealand in relation to China. So his works, I guess the latest publication was from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, Diplomacy in a Contested Region, which was published this year. And I'm sure he can share more of his expertise through his delivery. Then we'll have a connection from Singapore, from Dr. Eu Hwee, who is the director of the European Union Center in Singapore, and she's also at the Council Secretary at Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and also adjunct at the Rajamatan School of International Studies of the Nanyang Technological University. She will give us a bit take on the Southeast Asian, ASEAN views on these EU-ASEAN relations and Indo-Pacific. Velina Tchakarova, who is the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Vienna, Austria, will connect from, obviously, Vienna, but she will talk a bit about the Indian part and role and views on this particular topic today. Then we'll have connection from Malcolm Davies. Dr. Davies is in Canberra at the ASPI Institute, and he's actually a former colleague of mine from Australia, but he's since moved up to very close advisory role in the Australian governmental context as well, a very strategic advice on defense, capability development, military technology, and future warfare. So he'll give us a take on Australia and obviously the Chinese engagements over there. And then we have last speaker from Honolulu in Hawaii, very exotic, Dr. Richard Elam, who will talk about some sort of strategic foresights. And you can see everybody on the screen. Please, I should notice now that everybody's on the screen. So hello, everyone. And so Richard will talk about some kind of trends that we can expect for the future development. They are all coming from different backgrounds, so we'll have a very different mix of delivery of remarks. But without further delay, I pass word to Professor Patrick Köllner, and he's going to take about 7 to 10 minutes, and then we'll follow with the other speakers. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Alica, for the kind introduction and also for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Until about 15 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, the term Indo-Pacific was only known to marine biologists. That is, those studying sort of the fish and mammals traversing the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Little do these fish and mammals care whether one body of water is called that way and the adjacent body of water is called another way. But in the past 15 years or so, you will find the term entering much into official discourse. Most recently, last month, of course, in the joint communication of the European Commission and the High Representative on cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and we will hear more about that later. I think it's fair to note that the term Indo-Pacific has in many ways supplanted the older term Asia-Pacific, right? And I think it's also fair to say that sort of these two terms epitomize two different ages. So while the Asia-Pacific was very much about accelerated globalization, increasing interdependence, economic interdependence mainly, centering on that particular region, the Indo-Pacific, on the other hand, epitomizes a new age shaped by geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics. So in that context, you will hear sort of, lots about sort of the connections between politics and geography. You will hear about sea lanes of communication, maritime choke points. And when it comes to geoeconomics, of course, we are reminded of the Belt and Road Initiative and the various responses to that having led to what might be seen as a clash of connectivity strategies. So in my brief remarks in this introduction to this panel, I will try to sort of set the scene by tracing the rise of the Indo-Pacific concept and discuss what the term implies. So the term Indo-Pacific has been used early on in the early 2000s by strategic thinkers, first in India and Australia. And it was then later developed by governments in Delhi, where the term very much aligned with Narendra Modi's East Act policy, and in Canberra, where the term was first employed in the 2013 White Paper on Defence, and where it referred to Australia's two-ocean strategic environment. So these early adopters were followed by Japan. Actually, Japan's long-serving Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had talked in 2007 about the confluence of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean when visiting India. And later on, sort of this kind of thinking crystallized into a policy that had Indo-Pacific in there, but also became sort of adjectivized. So it was about the free and open Indo-Pacific. So the free, if you will, or the open, to start with that one, very much refers to then sort of right of overflight, of sort of maritime, the right sort of to navigate freely. While the free sort of is very much sort of to be sort of free of interference and to promote democracy on a larger scale. So this free and open Indo-Pacific has basically three dimensions. And the first is balancing. So that's about developing a stable multipolar balance in the region that can accommodate both a rising China and the formerly hegemonic United States. Second, it's about connectivity. So building and improving infrastructure in the region and connecting these two parts, the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. And third, it's about order building. So emphasizing the importance of maintaining commonly accepted rules and norms of interstate behavior. So you will see that the Indo-Pacific is primarily a strategic initiative and a way very much responding to the rise of China and the possible threats, perceived as they may be, that it poses. The eminent international relations scholar Amitav Acharya has very nicely put it. He has suggested that sort of the term the Far East, right, was coined by imperialists. The term sort of Asia then very much was used by nationalists in China, in India, in Japan. East Asia has been sort of the term of choice for culturalists. think of sort of East Asian values debate, which was very much about sort of East Asian values centered on Confucianism and so on. The concept of the Asia-Pacific sort of then very much promoted by economists, right? And finally, Indo-Pacific then is a term brought into life by strategists. And you will also see that in the kind of sort of institutional expressions that the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific have found. So the principal institutional expression of the Asia-Pacific, that's APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and a regional organization set up in 1989, very much to promote, to facilitate trade and investment within the region, right? To make business easier. So all about sort of accelerated globalization and so on, as I said. The prime or principal institutional expression of the Indo-Pacific is the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Initiative, bringing together the United States, two of its main security partners in the region, Australia and Japan, and then, of course, India, which very much likes to emphasize its strategic autonomy, but has become more aligned, let's put it that way, with sort of the United States in recent years. So I talked about Japan, Australia, India, and of course the US. So in the US, the Indo-Pacific entered the foreign policy lexicon in around 2010, foreshadowing what then became the pivot to Asia. So this was all about sort of improving, sort of strengthening of strategic relations with Australia, but most importantly with India. It was also about improving relations with secondary powers such as Vietnam. Under the Trump administration, the US actually followed Japan's lead and mainstreamed this free and open Indo-Pacific into a policy concept in 2017. And the Trump team then adopted in early 2018 a national security strategy, very much centered on the Indo-Pacific. It also subsequently renamed the military command in the Indo-Pacific to US Indo-Pacific Command. And so far, the Biden administration's policy towards the Indo-Pacific suggests that the region will assume an ever more important foreign policy significance for the United States. And the recent announcement of AUKUS, so very much a security partnership between the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom, supplying nuclear submarines to Australia and sharing sort of much high-tech technology, is very much testimony to that increasing importance. So what was sort of the Indo-Pacific all about? As I said, sort of very much a reaction to China's rise. And within Asia, conceived as Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, China sort of loomed ever larger, getting bigger and sort of more dominating. For a strategic thinker, sort of, if you're very much concerned about it, what do? You expand the region, right? Sort of, making it the Indo-Pacific. You bring in India, and thus sort of arrive at a new sort of balance of power. And that very much is behind the idea, and that's why why India is very much sort of important in that regard. So for the US also, it gave sort of, more strategic legitimacy to building relations with India, bilateral terms, but also in plurilateral terms. I already referred to the Quad, which is about military exercises. It is about broader foreign and security policy cooperation, also involving other sort of schemes more recently, distributing vaccines and so on. But at the core is security cooperation. So one important thing that they should all take away is that sort of the term Indo-Pacific is never sort of merely descriptive or value neutral. There are always sort of intentions and interests underlying the use of that term, right? And the term the notion of the Indo-Pacific makes most sense as a device to organize policy in a climate of geopolitical contestation, right? The way policymakers define or imagine regions, and the Indo-Pacific is a social construction, right? It is what you make out of it, or rather it is what policymakers and others contributing to public and policy discourse, sort of how they sort of conceive it, right? It's not sort of an objective geographic sort of, marker. Right, but it helps. I mean, it helps to sort of in terms of allocating resources, high-level attention, in terms of prioritizing security partners. Also, when it comes to regional organizations, their membership and agendas, there sort of the Indo-Pacific is very much sort of a device to organize that. So, as you know, and I'm slowly coming to the end, other regional entities and so on have also embraced the term Indo-Pacific in recent years, adding yet more sort of subtle but different shades of meaning. So the Indo-Pacific concept comes in different stripes and colors, if you will. Lepa Indonesia, the initially reticent ASEAN adopted the term in 2019 with a view to safeguarding its sort of claim to centrality in regional relations. And European nations have followed suit. First, France, that's no surprise. France has territories both in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, so it sees itself as an Indo-Pacific nation in that regard. Germany and the Netherlands then followed sort of last year. And of course, this year we have seen then the joint communication, the EU communication on cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And let's not forget the United Kingdom, which of course sees the Indo-Pacific as an opportunity to develop commercial ties, and more generally as an important area for engagement in its quest to reinvent itself as global Britain. Okay, strategic priorities among state actors vary when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. So Japan, for example, very much interested in the promotion of sort of free trade agreements, India being much more reluctant in that regard. But I guess what they all share is that sort of, the idea that the Indo-Pacific should not be a sort of China-dominated region, but rather a diverse, perhaps multipolar region. And you also see sort of lots of sort of emphasis on diversification of ties, sort of when it comes to foreign policies of relevant countries. And certainly not all countries employing this terminology of the Indo-Pacific would agree that the main aim is to resist China, or for that matter, contain China. Some of the current Indo-Pacific visions that you see are certainly much more inclusive than that. Okay, just let me end by summing up. So basically, the Indo-Pacific, I don't see it as a geographic area, but really more as a huge contested sort of strategic space that's affected by overarching geopolitical and geo-economic dynamics, but also by shared challenges that do not respect borders. Think COVID-19, think climate change. Certainly, this emerging economic and strategic center of gravity is of vital interest, not just to the nations in the region, but also to other actors with global interests. And I'll stop on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I think you gave us very good overview for all the speakers to fit into this overarching umbrella. I'll invite Hwee Yeo from Singapore. Hello, I hope it's not too late for you to connect. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and good morning to all, one and all. Of course, to those in Asia or in US, good evening or good afternoon. First, of course, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to share some perspectives on the Indo-Pacific after in the post-pandemic world. We are not quite in the post-pandemic world yet, I must say, but we hope that this pandemic will pass soon and we will be really in the post-pandemic world. I think Patrick has given a very good account, a very interesting account of how the concept of Indo-Pacific has come about, its different meanings to the different actors in the region, and of course its geostrategic significance. And indeed, I think the Indo-Pacific is poised to become the most complex and most contested region in the years to come. The region is now the center of the most intense rivalry between a competition between the US and China. And this competition between these two major powers is not the only concern for the other countries in the region. We have unresolved territorial disputes of course, add to the volatility of the region. We have many other climate change and other non-security challenges that are facing many countries in this region. So to confront all these different challenges, the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific will become more multi-layered and more diverse. The US has upped its efforts to corral its allies in the region with the formalization of the Quad that was already mentioned. And of course, the latest, the trilateral military alliance between Australia, UK, and the US, AUKUS. Whether this new architecture and alliances will replace the existing security frameworks led by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, existing frameworks such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus, Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. I think this would depend on what other actors and what ASEAN is going to do in response to all this contestation. ASEAN's centrality will, of course, be put to the test, but there's still time, I think, for ASEAN to work with other actors, such as the European Union, to ensure that the US-Sino rivalry is not the only narrative in the region. The EU and ASEAN can work together to reinforce and reiterate the need for a more collaborative and inclusive multilateral framework focused on collective endeavors to confront the various non-traditional security challenges and work to bring about sustainable peace and development to the peoples in the region. The EU on 16 September presented its strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Unfortunately, this came at a very wrong timing. It came at the same time as the announcement of AUKUS, which of course sets the media abuzz. So the EU Indo-Pacific strategy hence did not receive the attention that it should. The geographical scope of EU's Indo-Pacific is a region spanning from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Island states, in what supporters would call a comprehensive and ambitious blueprint for the EU strategy and priorities in this vast region. The underlying tone in this paper was focused on principled and long-term commitment towards partnership for peace and development. The EU strategy also calls on its strength as a committed multilateral actor with an open, inclusive, and collaborative approach towards the region. This is in great contrast to AUKUS, which is all about hard power and military alliance directed against China's growing military power and presence. What is heartening for us in Southeast Asia is that the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy has continued to acknowledge the centrality of ASEAN. So in that spirit, I think the EU and ASEAN really has to work much more closely together. We know that the EU and ASEAN has a long-standing partnership that was established way back in 1977. And in December 2020, this dialogue partnership was upgraded to a strategic partnership, which came, of course, as the result of the shared interests of both regional organizations in maintaining their autonomy and agency in the face of increasing geopolitical tensions from the US-China rivalry. The EU's desire to strengthen its strategic autonomy and the ASEAN's efforts to maintain its centrality in its neighborhood require both to think much more carefully about how they can complement and support each other's efforts. I think AUKUS was a rude awakening for both the EU and ASEAN. The message could not have been clearer. The US-America first and transactional approach towards the outside world has remained despite the end of the Trump administration. Blindsided by AUKUS, the room for maneuver will narrow if the EU and ASEAN do not take steps to strengthen their capability and agency. To the extent that the EU Indo-Pacific strategy takes an exclusive and broad-based approach similar to the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, there is much that ASEAN and EU can do together to put substance into their strategic partnership. Together, I think they must seize the initiative to proactively counter the new Cold War mentality that is emerging in this US-China rivalry. The EU and ASEAN have begun engagement in a number of the 7 priority areas that the EU has identified in its Indo-Pacific strategy: sustainable and inclusive prosperity, green transition, ocean governance, digital governance, connectivity, security and defense, and human security. Continuing on the path of economic integration would help ASEAN build the internal coherence and resilience needed to maintain its centrality. At the same time, the EU, by working with other partners and through ASEAN-led regional architectures such as the ARF, the East Asia Summit, will have a chance to assert its own identity and build credible capability to become an actor of consequence in the Indo-Pacific region. What is important for us to bear in mind is that we all owe it to our own people to offer a future that is filled with hope and opportunities. There are, of course, real challenges that we have to be aware of, but we must not let our inaction lure us into a future of conflicts and tensions. And I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this is so important. The timing of the EU, the sort of presentation of the Indo-Pacific, but also you mentioned France, which obviously somewhat suffered setback with the introduction of, I guess I pronounce it AUKUS, but that was quite a diplomatic spat, and that's another discussion for us to have. But I'll let Velina Tchakarova take us to India from Vienna, if you don't mind, deliver your thoughts. So we have a complete picture, and also people who are online, we have a website, www.slido.com, where you can use hashtag Simpo2021 to actually ask questions. So use that, please. And hello, Velina. Good to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the excellent insights by the other guest speakers. And I will take the floor by elaborating on India's interests, India's view on the Indo-Pacific, and specifically the increasing competition with China. We've already got a picture on the Indo-Pacific region as a concept, as well as also as a region that will be increasingly witnessing various actors' constellations. In my view, the global power competition is clearly moving eastwards and is now predominantly concentrated in the Indo-Pacific region. This is where geopolitics and geoeconomics meet in the 21st century, which is why I also call this decade in one of my articles last year, the Indo-Pacific Decade. At the top of the global system, we are witnessing the systemic rivalry between the United States and China. But at the meta level of international relations, there are various fluid ad hoc geopolitical and geoeconomic constellations of the regional powers oscillating between Beijing and Washington, while trying to avoid the scenario of taking sides. And here we have a clear exception in the case of India. With India being on its path to becoming the third largest economic power in this or probably next decade, and as a natural long-term rival of China, the Indo-Pacific region is slowly but surely becoming the main arena for not just global power competition, but also regional competition between the two Asian giants. In addition, the bilateralization of the international relations, as we witnessed it during the previous US administration, coupled with traditional South Asian security dilemmas, such as between China, India, and Pakistan in South Asia, as well as the imminent global supply chains reconfiguration following the COVID-19 pandemic, provide this fertile soil for profound tectonic shifts in the global affairs. Now, China and India, as we know, are the two nuclear armed nations with the largest militaries and populations in Asia. They are slowly but surely turning into regional rivals, despite their shared aspiration for multipolarity and cooperation on various international issues of mutual interest. From a geopolitical point of view, the new great game will be predominantly situated in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean due to this rising competition between New Delhi and Beijing, but also due to the systemic rivalry between China and the US at the top of the system. So the geopolitical approach of both countries reflects a constructive pragmatism when necessary. Let me remind you that they still cooperate in various regional formats, but also it entails increasingly a comprehensive competition whenever possible. Their relationship in the coming years will be increasingly shaped by economic, or rather said, geoeconomic competition, geostrategic rivalry, and a certain readiness for confrontation in the quest for shaping this common geopolitical space called the Indo-Pacific region. So political, economic, diplomatic relations between India and China have grown significantly in the recent decades, but will be now shaped increasingly by rivalry. The two nuclear armed nations are slowly but surely turning into the most significant regional rivals. That is my call, which is why we have also witnessed the transformation of an Asian Pacific into Indo-Pacific region, with a clear focus, of course, on India as taking the central place, occupying the central place in various strategic documents by the West. So the clashes with China along the disputed Himalayan border and the Chinese presence on the Tibetan plateau are neither expected to diminish nor likely to be resolved diplomatically in this decade. Instead, such incidents between Indian and Chinese troops can be expected to repeatedly occur in the coming years and, in fact, to deepen and intensify. India will have to develop its transport infrastructure near the common border, as well as transfer its military to enhance its capabilities to contain Chinese activities near Indian territory. Just as China sees the United States as its most significant systemic competitor, India sees China in a similar light. Additionally, India is more cautious since Beijing has established close ties with Pakistan, while China increasingly distrusts New Delhi because of its warming relations with the United States. So in this geopolitical context, Pakistan is clearly the bone of contention between them, and the Kashmir region has been a focal point for conflict, as we all know, since India's foundation. So it will be further witness escalation phases. India seeks to be the most significant naval power in the wider Indian Ocean region, as the Chinese presence is becoming menacing to India's cause there. Let me point to two clear geoeconomic cases which enabled China to get an access to the Indian Ocean and to project power beyond its territories, the one being the Pakistan-China economic corridor with the port in Gwadar, and the other connectivity now being in Myanmar with the second economic corridor, creating an absolutely new line of value chain and a geoeconomic power projection via the territory of Myanmar to Singapore. So what the future brings is that the two Asian Goliaths are already vying for limited resources at a time when the COVID-19 crisis has been exacerbating their domestic socioeconomic weaknesses and disrupting the global supply chains. A large proportion of the world's goods, as well as energy transports, pass through the Indo-Pacific region, entailing some of the most significant maritime routes and global choke points for food and oil supply. Around 40% of the world's oil shipments and 1/3 of the annual global trade in goods pass through the Indian and Pacific Oceans, including critical transport hubs such as the Straits of Hormuz, the connection to the Persian Gulf, and the Strait of Malacca, the main artery between the two oceans. An immense proportion of the world's raw materials supplies also pass through the Indian Ocean on their way from Africa to the South China Sea and beyond. So given the increasing interconnections in the Indo-Pacific region, a rise in tensions can be expected due to this enhanced competition over natural resources and the blue water status, the hindered access to free navigation along the oil and food choke points, and we all witness what happens if only one of these global choke points gets blockaded, reference to the crisis with the Suez Canal, but also disrupted access to shared water resources in their transboundary rivers, which is going to be another major issue in the relations between China and India in the future. And last but not least, Beijing's controversial region Xinjiang occupies a strategic position in China's main terrestrial connectivity projects within the BRI. Here in the West, we attend to discuss the topic from the point of view of humanitarian issues, from the violations of human rights and liberties, as well as minorities violations. However, there is also a geoeconomic factor. This is the primary route for major terrestrial connectivities from China towards Europe. One route goes through Russia, another one goes through Central Asia, another one's with a deviation towards Turkey and the Black Sea, and finally the one that I named through Pakistan. So obviously Xinjiang, which is known for its forced labor camps, broad violations of human rights against the Muslim Uyghurs, is of great importance as China asserts claims over parts also of India's Arunachal Pradesh, while India claims the Aksai Chin region connecting Tibet with Xinjiang in northwest China. So we have also, in addition to all other issues, unresolved territorial claims that, of course, will add additional fuel to the fire. So in a sense, the rapprochement between China and Pakistan, the systemic coordination between China and Russia, what I've called the dragon bear since 2015, and now it is also the manifestation of this strategic coordination that is being observed on the ground in South Asia, a reference point, for instance, Afghanistan. This is the much broader geopolitical context in South Asia and in the Indo-Pacific region, and of course affects India's geopolitical choices. So logically, the United States regards India as a significant and a reliable partner in creating a counterweight to China's overwhelming presence in this particular region. But in a sense, India hasn't made its choice yet. So there are, in my view, two plausible middle-term scenarios for the Indo-Pacific. either the United States will manage to forge a partnership, probably even an alliance with India, and of course, other like-minded partners. Some of the examples were already mentioned, such as Quad countries, but also the AUKUS, in order to establish a serious presence, geoeconomic and geopolitical presence in the region, and also create a significant counterweight to China's growing influence. Whereas the relationship towards Russia is still very questionable. So in a sense, Russia is going to be this kind of free rider in the region. And there is an open question mark about Russia's future role. Or the United States and China will somehow engage in a partial relaxation of bilateral tensions. Rather unlikely in my view, but still possible scenario. In a sense, they agree on a kind of a new systemic coexistence based on a mutual assured destruction, so to say, and decide to more or less involve in alternative networks with alternative partnerships and actors. And here, once again, India would have to make some tough geopolitical choices in a sense, because on the one side, it has to decide whether it wants to align itself with probably what is called the Anglosphere geopolitical world being led by the United States, or it decides to go third way, in a sense, by leading a new block of non-aligned partners and allies. In a sense, non-aligned would have a new meaning, but if we look at the European Union and the European powers discussions right now, also the strategic documents, it points to a kind of a third way, in a sense that the European Union is still trying to oscillate between the United States and China, not by avoiding to take sides. And probably one possible partnership might evolve around this kind of non-alignment configurations. So geographically speaking, China is indeed an Asian Pacific country, while India is turning slowly but surely into an Indo-Pacific one. The focal point of intersection between China's terrestrial and maritime connectivity projects is indeed situated in the Indo-Pacific region, where Beijing will further seek to enhance its presence and geoeconomic leverage, and that is India's clear view about this in the next decade. So, as I said, the final decision hasn't been made yet in New Delhi, but the trend clearly points to aligning with the Anglosphere world. And here, as I said, as a European and also as an analyst of the role of the European Union and the European powers in the world, I have a question open. Basically, I have an open question mark about the future role of the European Union as a security actor in the Indo-Pacific region. So this would also decide the bilateral relationship with India. Thank you. I would stop here.
Thank you, Velina. Very informative. We will have to ask the speakers to stick to 10 minutes so we have discussion, but everything you said was quite, I think, important, even in terms of the directions. What surprises me is the neutral part, since India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and has military exercises also with Russia and China. So that's a very big space now with the inclusion of Iran to consider, I think, also in your assessment is what I would also add. Moving on to Malcolm Davis, who's connecting from Australia. Hello, Malcolm. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Alica, and it's great to be here, have the chance to talk on this really interesting topic. An Australian perspective on this is interesting to look at where we are now and where we've come from. Historically, if you look back to the Cold War period, Australia was very much in a strategic backwater. The main action was taking place in Europe between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and also at the strategic central nuclear level in the balance of nuclear power, and with proxy wars happening along the periphery, but the focus was very much on Europe. Today, in the 21st century, Australia is not in a strategic backwater. We're a frontline state to a rising period of strategic competition between a rising China and the United States. And the key challenge that we face in the Indo-Pacific region is the implication of a rising and assertive China that is determined, firstly, to end US strategic primacy in the Indo-Pacific region, and secondly, to create a Chinese-led regional security order and political and economic order that allows it to restore what I think it would like to see, which is the China dream leading to essentially a 21st century version of the Middle Kingdom, where China is the central power and states along its periphery but pay tribute to it in return for, in terms of accommodating its interests in return for their prosperity and their security. From our perspective, that sort of outcome, where China basically dominates the Indo-Pacific region, is unacceptable. And the reason it's unacceptable is because we have been certainly on the sharp end of China's political warfare and grey zone actions against our country since 2015, when we refused to allow the Chinese government to have the right to control our national critical communications infrastructure, our information infrastructure through Hwee, and then we challenged a lot of their efforts on using political warfare to influence our national debate on our political, strategic, and economic allegiances. So certainly since 2015, from an Australian perspective, we have been making a strong effort to boost our relationship with our traditional allies, the United States at the front, but obviously as well Japan, India, Indonesia, the other ASEAN states, and increasingly more recently South Korea. And we recognize that, you know, whilst it's open to debate as to whether we are in a new Cold War type arrangement, I certainly think we are in a period of intensifying strategic competition between a rising China and the United States that's not going to end anytime soon. And there's real risks with this new period of strategic competition. And so I'll go through some of the issues that I think are concerning strategic analysts here in Australia, and particularly with what is driving developments such as AUKUS and the Quad and other defence arrangements. The concern has to be that China's efforts in terms of rapid military modernisation and its clear intention to try and seize control of Taiwan against the wishes of the Taiwanese people will happen sometime this decade. We watch as Xi Jinping makes strongly nationalist speeches in various different fora, where he makes it very clear that in terms of the China dream, Beijing seeks control of Taiwan. This is irrespective of the wishes of the Taiwanese people, who do not consider themselves Chinese. They consider themselves Taiwanese. And they look at the experience of the people in Hong Kong and the people in Xinjiang, and they want no part of returning to China. And so what we are seeing is an increasing campaign of coercion, military coercion, political, economic coercion directed against Taiwan by China. And you're seeing that now on a daily basis, with large numbers of air sorties being carried out by the People's Liberation Army Air Force against Taiwanese air defense identification zones, with the record being yesterday of 52 aircraft, including bombers, deploying into Taiwanese airspace. The concern is, of course, that this campaign of coercion will increase in coming years, designed to essentially get Taipei to, if I can borrow a phrase from Game of Thrones, bend the knee to Beijing and to accept reunification on Beijing's terms under the 1992 consensus. I think the thinking here is that Taipei will not bend the knee, will resist this coercion, even if it intensifies in coming years through actions such as seizing offshore territories, such as Paradise Island, air and naval blockades, cyber attacks. Taipei will hold firm. And so sometime in the second half of this decade, I think the risk is that China will be tempted to use military force to seize control of Taiwan. And that, I think, is the big concern, the immediate concern for Australian strategic planners, is how do we respond to the risk that intensifying strategic competition between the United States and China could slide into major power conflict sometime in this decade. That is what's focusing our attention, and that is what is driving decisions such as AUKUS. Let me say a bit about some things about AUKUS. AUKUS is obviously a technology sharing agreement at the most basic level. The key takeaway, of course, being the decision by the United States and the United Kingdom to assist Australia in getting nuclear-powered and propelled submarines. But it covers a range of other technology areas as well. It's enabling us to boost our long-range strike capabilities in a fairly significant manner. And it's also opening up the possibility of cooperation in research development in critical and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, other unmanned underwater systems, and advanced military capabilities such as hypersonics. But more importantly than the technology sharing aspects of AUKUS, I think is the geopolitical and strategic aspects of AUKUS. AUKUS does two things. Firstly, it makes it very clear to China that we are no longer sitting on the fence in terms of trying to manage and maintain a strategic alliance with the United States whilst maintaining a trading relationship with China. We have recognized that it is impossible to maintain that balancing position any longer because of China's actions under Xi Jinping. AUKUS would not exist if it were not for China's actions under Xi Jinping. So we have made the firm decision under AUKUS to strongly boost and very clearly align ourselves with the United States and the United Kingdom to counterbalance and deter China. And this is the basis where we're going from now. The second point is AUSMIN, which basically had its meeting almost immediately after the AUKUS agreement was announced. AUSMIN made very clear that it would open up the prospect for Australia to host US forces on a much larger scale than what we've done in the past. And so this was a very positive development in terms of strengthening our ability to deter and counterbalance China and making it more possible for US forces to operate in the region to undertake that role at less risk. So expect to see a greater US presence in Australia in coming years. The third critical development in recent weeks, of course, has been the Quad Summit. And the Quad links in very nicely with AUKUS and ANZUS as well, in the sense that you have India, Japan, Australia, and the United States all working together to a degree in terms of working together on defense cooperation and security. If you look at the key focus areas of the Quad, they're focusing on critical and emerging technologies, infrastructure, sustainable supply chains. All of that has military relevance. And so that links in very nicely with the technology focus and the geopolitical focus of AUKUS. So these three developments, AUKUS, AUSMIN, the Quad, sent a very strong message to Beijing that we will not back down in the face of their coercion. And so what happens next? I think you will see an intensive period of discussion within these three groupings and also within ANZUS on how we can proceed to strengthen the deterrent capability to prevent China from actually taking that fatal step of a cross-straits invasion of Taiwan. And make no mistake, I think the US, the UK, and Australia do not want war with China. We want to deter such a conflict from happening in the first place. But we recognize that deterrence may fail. and that in the end, Xi may decide he needs to take military action in order to secure Taiwan, in order to secure his own grip on power. So therefore, we need to have the military capabilities in terms of long-range strike, naval forces, and most importantly, building multilateral defensive cooperation measures to work in a crisis whereby we can respond decisively to any Chinese challenge. And I think that's probably going to be the focus of the next 18 months to 2 years on how we proceed from here. Certainly there is a challenge in terms of AUKUS and the submarines, because it's now becoming clear that it's going to take some time to get nuclear submarines. And we do need them this decade rather than in the 2030s. So I think that's going to be a major focus for AUKUS going forward. But certainly I think that there will be all sorts of discussions about how we can boost future defense cooperation in the region, including not just between the AUKUS states and the Quad, but also looking to boost cooperation with ASEAN and also strengthening our relationships, our bilateral relationships with countries such as South Korea and Canada, and I would say the European states. We have some fence mending to do with the French, and we'll make an effort to do that. Let me finish up by saying some discussions about new operational domains, because this is becoming increasingly important as well. Australia, like India, like the United States, like the UK, is recognizing the importance of the space domain, and we are making firm steps for Australia to be a key actor in space as an operational domain. We're strengthening our defense space cooperation through CSPO for starters, but we're also moving rapidly towards having an ability to launch satellites from Australian launch sites on Australian launch vehicles. So expect us to burden share in orbit to a much greater degree. At the same time, we are strengthening our ability to operate in cyberspace. And I think space and cyberspace go together, essentially two sides of the same coin, and both will be critical in deterring and counterbalancing China. Now the camera has switched back to Alica, which I take as a sign that I'm out of time. So I will finish there, and I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. I wish I could give you more time, because the latest Australia's engagement, I think, lifted many people off their chairs, including myself. So we definitely will want to have more discussions. But I'm moving on to Aloha Land with Richard Lam, who will give us some foresights from the US perspective.
Aloha, everybody. I am in Honolulu, Hawaii, and it is a difficult job. Somebody has to do it, so you're all very welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, as it is around the world. It's a privilege to be here with everybody and to be on a panel with such august and insightful speakers. And Malcolm, you get points not only for mentioning Game of Thrones in your opening remarks, but also you mentioned a scenario about the New Middle Kingdom. And several years ago, we had worked on a set of scenarios looking at different trajectories for the world order. And absolutely a New Middle Kingdom was one of those scenarios that got a lot of discussion. And so I think, to sort of look at this region, and I will try to be quick, I'm looking at the time at the same time. Clearly, like others, like Velina said, the Indo-Pacific region is this growing center of gravity. And as you look at this next 50 to 100 years, it very much looks like it will be an Indo-Pacific century, and for good reason. And that region itself is, of course, situated in a broader picture and a longer term view. And I think the bottom line is, when we are looking at the next 10 to 15 years, I think the fight for a rules-based order will get harder for us, not easier. When you look at all the different pressures, the pressures on the players all across ASEAN, on the pressures on the players from outside the region that are trying to play a role, the pressures on all of the actors and all the new actors coming to bear and becoming powerful and being able to create effects within this context, the tensions are greater and the pressures on everybody are getting greater. where the opportunities for conflict are increasing. And the world itself, in a larger picture, has been gearing up for conflict in the last several years. And so when we are looking at everything from military modernization across the globe, increased expenditures, increased numbers of actors involved in various roles in conflict, and everything including all of the resistance operations that surely everybody in Europe is very aware of at this point. I think everybody has been gearing up for these conflicts. That's not to say everything is negative, but I think this fight is going to get harder and not easier. And if we were to just start with looking at some of the trends that have been driving change up until about now, there are several things that are, out of all the many possible things, we are looking, of course, at China. China is growing. And of course, and as Malcolm alluded to, the Chinese Communist Party is not interested in democratic or liberal values, right? And that matters. And many of the things, the strategies and actions that others have already mentioned, that's a reality. And so how they project power, they're watching, all of us, of course, are watching how they are becoming an actor on the global stage. And as their capabilities and their confidence in their capabilities have increased, the way that they have asserted themselves, I think everybody expects them to assert themselves. I think in many cases, it's troubling to a lot of actors, the way in which they are asserting themselves. And so you have this rising actor who's going to clearly going to be key and central in this region, already not engaged, not interested in the rules-based order that had been there before. At the same time, right, and still looking at that level of sort of values and worldview differences, there is around the world, but particularly in the West, there has been for many years a growing disaffection with traditional Western institutions and even narratives. And so the loss of faith in government, the loss of faith in traditional institutions, again, particularly in the West, but not solely in that region, we have seen an increasing sort of pushback and rejection of some of those traditional Western liberal ideology that shaped much of the modern world. So even among the actors in the West, there is going to be an increasingly difficult ability to carry out those policies, many of the types of policies that we're talking about here today. And at the same time, another trend that we've been watching for many years, if not decades at this point, has been the fact that nation states, continue to see their ability to influence, to govern in the face of these complex challenges, their ability to deter various actors and conflict actors in the world. States have been seeing their ability to do that wane. And so even in this moment in which we are looking to states to step up, and a greater number of states to step up and innovate and become part of these governance solutions, states are being challenged with their ability to operate and govern and solve problems in this increasingly interdependent and global environment. And some of those challenges relate to some of our other trends that are important. Certainly, continuing climate change in the region is going to have a major impact. It is already having a major impact, right? We're finally at that point in the world where we're not so much debating whether climate change exists. We are dealing with a lot of the consequences that are manifesting. And at the same time, of course, combined with climate change, we have all of the urbanization trends and all of the trends in development in the littoral zones. So we are pushing straight into those regions in which climate change is going to have some of the biggest impact. And of course, related to this, right, all of the tensions that are growing around resources, everything from fishing to water, all of these things are increasing pressures on all of the actors and all of the populations in the region. And then we look at some of the other trends outside of that when we're looking at the emerging technology and infrastructure that is shaping our daily lives. Those emerging technologies and infrastructures that we are so dependent on today, the very thing that's allowing us to do this today, that has allowed us to continue to operate during the midst of a global pandemic. These technologies, as much as many of us grew up thinking they were going to be these great liberating forces, many of these technologies are being designed and deployed increasingly to control political communities rather than empower them, which is just another sort of angle that is sort of, if you want to call it, sort of an anti-liberal bent. And there's a tension there because these technologies and all of this digital infrastructure that we're creating has great potential for empowering communities and populations. And it also has a great ability to control and surveil those populations in a lot of different ways. And there's a significant siren call that these opportunities have for governments and actors around the world that are more inclined to be authoritarian. And I'm not singling out China in any way. This is appealing to many actors around the world. And all of this technology and infrastructure is becoming increasingly important. And so it becomes increasingly important to look at that tension and who's designing it, who's deploying it, and all of those types of things. And they're not necessarily states that are doing that, right? And so related to that trend is how over the last several years, we've been talking about increasingly how individuals and groups have been gaining increasing power to create strategic effects in the world. Certainly in defense circles, we talk about the state-like capabilities that actors of all types today have, and very much coming off of those emerging technologies and infrastructures I was just talking about. And because of those same infrastructures, individuals and groups around the world today can very much, even if just for a small period of time, take action, become involved in conflicts, help exacerbate conflicts, and create strategic effects. We see it every day all over the world. And when we are looking at some of the other broader trends in the world, we are looking at the fact that conflicts around the world in general are becoming more protracted, right? And as Malcolm alluded to, increasingly conflict around the world is crossing domains, right? It's breaking down traditional definitions, it's crossing boundaries and not just physical boundaries. And increasingly they're involving a broader range of actors. Now, all of these are just some of the trends that have been reshaping the world and the region. And they are some of the trends that are contributing to the momentum, right, of the future that we're looking at. Those trends may bend or break at some point, but they have been some of the things that have been sort of carving out the shape of the world up until about now. Now, when we sort of look over the further horizon and we try and anticipate some of the emerging issues, some of the potential threats and opportunities that some of these trends may produce in the years ahead, some of those emerging issues, right? These are possibilities, include the possibility of a fractured world in which we're dealing with a closed and competing information systems. We've all benefited greatly from a global internet, and yet part of what we are seeing is increasingly governments in different parts of the world and different actors really trying to create walled and separate systems that they're able to control, either from a national level or from a corporate level. And so one of the emerging issues you start to become concerned with as you look over the horizon is really the development of a very fractured world. Now, one of the other emerging issues that we become interested in is the rising potential and importance of middle powers in the world and in new powers, right? Increasingly, not just in regions like the Indo-Pacific, where middle powers are increasingly important because they are not the two big players, right? And so increasingly we're looking to middle powers, but also because many of those trends that we were just talking about in terms of the diffusion of state-like capabilities, the increasing power that individuals and smaller groups have. When we watch some of the conflicts that are going on today, whether it's between Armenia and Azerbaijan, looking at Yemen, Syria, all these different places, increasingly other powers outside of the traditional great powers are really starting to play an important role, not just in the conflicts, but in intervening in the conflicts. And that's one of those things I think you're looking to in the future. In terms of technology, when we're looking out over the horizon, certainly we have concerns about the notion of controlling the future high ground. And that includes everything from technology leadership, right? Again, emerging technologies and infrastructures are becoming critical, and strategic competition around those things is becoming intense. And so the idea of controlling that tech leadership, being the ones to define that technology and the standards in the years ahead. And again, Malcolm mentioned this earlier, launch in LEO, the space economy, that's a real thing. And really having to look at how the geometry of everything starts to change and shift as we develop and have a competitive development of a genuine international space economy as we move out from LEO to cislunar and lunar, as Jeff Bezos takes his orbits around the planet. And then I think finally, one of the other emerging issues, again, a possibility that we become interested in as we look over the horizon, is the notion of new actors innovating new concepts of partnerships and alliances. And certainly we've talked a lot this morning about the importance of alliances and partnerships. And that's one of the key issues that we all want to talk about. And when we are looking at how conflict is changing around the world, how the tools to create strategic effects against each other and for each other are evolving and changing. And as we're watching new types of actors take the stage and shape the world in very meaningful ways, one of the things you're looking at and want to sort of look at closer is this potential around people to innovate what it means to have partnerships and alliances. The old forms are not going to go away, but you're really looking at this growing space, this potential for some of these new partnerships and alliances. Now, and I will hurry up to the end here. When we are looking forward and we're trying to map that emerging landscape that is the future, you also start to see a number of critical key uncertainties, right, around which we really don't know which way things are going to go, and yet around which everything starts to get shaped. One of those key uncertainties, and already alluded to by others, is absolutely what role will the US choose to play? And I know for many in the region, the inconsistency in US engagement and the very apparent lack of attention to the region off and on over the years is concerning, and rightly so. I don't have the answer to what this is going to be, but I do think absolutely that's one of the key uncertainties is what will the US decide? What role will it decide to play? It won't be able to do everything, but I think everybody would like very much to know, is the US going to play a big role and is it going to stay? One of the other key uncertainties, and this seems a little field, but again, because of the dominance of the geotechnological competition that's going on and the competition over both defining and actually deploying emerging technologies and controlling that and using that for national ends, there is a genuine uncertainty around how much value there really will be for that first mover advantage. And this usually comes up when we're talking about dominating the future of AI and quantum and all of these other technologies that are seen as strategic technologies. But it's a genuine uncertainty when you look at the nature of these technologies and how quickly they evolve and how quickly they diffuse, whether or not being the first to develop and deploy these technologies is going to have the same kind of first mover advantage that previous eras technology offered. And a final thought, both in terms of an uncertainty when we're looking forward in the future of the region, and also as a little bit of a provocation. Many of us have come to the question about the Indo-Pacific region and what the future of it looks like, and more broadly, what the future of the world order looks like. And we often automatically frame this conversation as a transition, right? A transition from whether it's a US-led world order to maybe a China-led world order, or the previous global international liberalism to something else. But we often frame it as a transition from a previous era to a new defined era. And the question is, the uncertainty that we actually have when we look at a lot of the trends and interactions today is, what if things don't settle down? What if all of these relationships, these contests, these tensions that we're referring to remain fluid? What if this landscape remains in flux and does not, in fact, settle down into a nice, new, stable order? Have we considered how we will operate and how we will manage over the next 10 to 20 years if it never does settle down? Because again, I think a lot of us who love history, love seeing history in terms of these different definable eras. And yet when we're looking forward, I think today when we look at a lot of the drivers and a lot of the dynamics, I think this is an uncertainty that we should spend some time thinking about and looking at. And with that, I will stop talking, Alica.
Mahalos. So many good points again, and I think I like the additional thought also on how are we focusing so much on the great powers, yet there are all these smaller players. And as you said, it seems like everybody sort of reactivated their efforts to modernize and innovate. And I think this is such a good space to explore. We have about, I already added 5 minutes to our debate because we started later. So if you need to get your coffees, who are you who are here, walk over. You don't have to wait until the coffee break. But we have quite a few questions here from the online space. I'm going to deliver them to speakers so they can think about very concise, up to 3-minute answers. I would appreciate if you can stick to this allocated time. And then we'll, in the quick second round, we'll take questions from here. But for Patrick, there was this question about how Germany actually views Indo-Pacific specifically, and possibly how do you project they will contribute to the EU's maybe Indo-Pacific strategy, but also seeing this dynamic of big players in Europe like UK and France being involved in media in different contexts with what's happening there. But we don't hear so much about German input or views, so perhaps that's a good one to explore. Lei Hwee, if you don't mind, there is a question whether you believe there are specific EU member states or ASEAN states that can work together to foster an inclusive multilateralism. And also, can you expect better cooperation between EU and ASEAN in the sphere of human rights? And whether that won't be a potential obstacle in their better relations. For Velina, Tchakarova, there were 2 questions with regards to China. Whether it's as concerned about growing India's influence in the region as India is about China, and should it be? And also, there was another question related to Russia. You mentioned that you expect Russia to remain an outsider. Are there any voices inside the region to include the country in cooperative efforts? Malcolm, with the AUKUS initiative only, is it going to only short-term weaken France in the region, or will there be a long-term consequence? And do you think that Australia's alignment with the UK could foster Ms. Hwee's idea on EU-ASEAN reinforcing an inclusive multilateral framework? So people are actually linking your topics now. I don't have questions for Richard right now, but I'll keep. Oh, there is one. Sorry. Can the presence of states in conflicts, other than the ones involved, be explained by the fact that there are more sovereign states in the world today? So we have a bit different kind of question here, not as specific with regards to US policies. So I'll give you about 3 minutes, please. We'll start with Patrick.
Right, thank you. Well, Germany's perceptions, perspectives on the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I'm not the spokesman of the Federal Foreign Office, but certainly, I mean, it makes sense to have a look at sort of the guidelines that came out last year. And actually, the wording in itself is interesting. It's guidelines. It's not strategy, right? So Germany be very careful, sort of, to use this kind of terminology, also given sort of, Germany's history, of course. And unlike sort of the French strategy on the Indo-Pacific, it was not led by the Department of Defense. It was led by the Federal Foreign Office, which sort of coordinated then across ministries and making this sort of a whole of government approach. What is important is that you would find, as with the EU, sort of communications, 7 areas of engagement. And we have talked quite a bit in this panel about sort of, maritime security. And of course, the maritime security dimension sort of also, that's the one that attracted most media attention, because that's something new, sort of, Germany sending a frigate to the Indo-Pacific. But it's the Indo-Pacific strategy is much broader. It's 7 domains. It's all about sort of, environmental cooperation. It's about even sort of including sort of cultural diplomacy, something that, for example, the EU strategy doesn't involve, digital cooperation in the digital realm, and so on. So it's a multi-pronged approach. And certainly when it comes to China, sort of very much in line with sort of, the EU's policy on China, which, the mantra by now, sort of, seeing China as a partner, as a partner, especially when it comes to sort of, global commons issues, right? Be it sort of climate change, adapting to climate change, mitigating climate change, also global health. China as a partner, as a sort of, as a very necessary partner. But of course, also China as a competitor for industries, companies, and so on, and as a systemic rival. Right, sort of offering a different kind of sort of economic and political system. So I believe it's a very nuanced approach, and certainly Germany and I think the EU as a whole doesn't sort of like this choice of being forced into a choice between sort of China and the US. I mean, it's clear where our strategic and security collaboration is, but of course also there are plenty of there's plenty of scope for collaboration with China. China has changed tremendously under Xi Jinping, but hey, this is 1.3 billion people. This is not just Xi Jinping, right? And sort of we will also see sort of how China is going to develop in the long term. I'm not going to belittle, and I'm very concerned about what's happening in the Taiwan Straits there. But taking a long sort of term horizon might also help, and not to. I mean, we talked about sort of the Indo-Pacific this morning, and everyone now obviously, hopefully, will understand it's a very important concept. But we shouldn't see everything through the lens of the Indo-Pacific, right? Perspectives of smaller players, and sort of taking them seriously, their own perspectives and narratives. And it's not just about sort of the Indo-Pacific. Think about sort of Pacific Island states. Sort of that narrative is about the blue Pacific, sort of the importance of the Pacific for global well-being, right? And that's a very different sort of narrative where sort of, the biggest sort of threat sort of to mankind and Pacific Island countries is not China, it's climate change. Okay, so something to chew on. Maybe 2 words. As Germany always been a big fan of multilateralism, so ASEAN centrality matters very much to the federal government. One thing, and I don't need a last round of comments, so I just finish here. Sort of, one thing we should all do is sort of do as Richard, sort of get rid of your sort of Atlantic-centered maps of the world, put on a Pacific-centered map of the world. It really sort of, gives you a sort of different perspective on things. National Geographic has a very good map. I don't get a percentage, but so that's something we should do to change our perspective. And the other thing is that maybe tune in. We have a brilliant series at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, together with our French colleagues, Syrie, Sciences Po, the Franco-German Observatory in the Indo-Pacific, sort of perspectives from the region, and actually this Friday, sort of Gunnar Wiegand, sort of one of the brains behind sort of the European strategy on cooperation in the Pacific, will be with us. So please join us there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I love this. The shake-up of the whole hour and a half in terms of not even focusing on climate change, but China, and like framing everything under Indo-Pacific. And I was lucky to live in US and Europe and Asia-Pacific in different places. And as you said, there are always different maps on the wall and different projections of the context. So I think we need to look at that and maybe have more different kind of discussions, not just the mainstream in some ways. But I'm going to move on to Lei Hwee, if you don't mind.
I'll keep it short. I think the question is on the EU-ASEAN cooperation, and we know that the EU and ASEAN now has a better understanding of each other. They are 2 regional organizations, but of very different institutional and setup, right? So I think the EU has come to a very pragmatic stance where they will work with some ASEAN partners, and the intergovernmental nature of ASEAN allows that. So I think in terms of working more strategically. They may not work with the whole of the ASEAN, but they will work with some willing partners, whether it's Indonesia, Vietnam, or Singapore, to push some of this agenda that we talk about, whether it's on digital connectivity, on green transition and issues like that. On the human rights, I think, yes, it is a challenge in terms of because of the different interpretations. And again, EU and ASEAN both pride themselves as norm setters, but we have a different set of norms. EU focus a lot on democracy, freedom, fundamental freedoms. The ASEAN look at sovereign equality, principle of non-interference as much more important. But I think if we again take a more pragmatic approach, I think by focusing on human security and again look at it in a pragmatic way to see where is an entry point where we can all agree on some of the issues. For instance, on Myanmar, we know it's a terrible situation there, but if we take a human security approach, we may be able to work together on some humanitarian actions together, or at least try to work together to come up with some entry point to Myanmar in the humanitarian aspect, and do something concrete and specific that can help the people. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. I look forward to Velina's concise answer now. Thank you.
Yes, this will be a challenge, as the questions would require at least another hour of explanation. So I will make it very, very short. China treats India as a second-order rival. This is the first question about the way how China sees India. So China treats and views India as a second-order rival due to its predominant focus on the systemic competition with the United States, while India considers China the primary existential threat to its geopolitical and geoeconomic interests in the Indo-Pacific region. And let me stress that China is currently in this unique position to become the first heartland and rimland power at once. That means expanding both in Eurasia and in the Indo-Pacific region. The power projection, that is really a unique situation that we haven't witnessed in the last 2 centuries, with Great Britain and then United States becoming global powers. This is a very short, I know, very short answer, but we don't have time for more. The second question is also highly interesting, because Russia is now this missing geopolitical puzzle piece in the great equation of the bifurcation of the global system. None of the main global rivals wants to see Russia being part of the others bloc. So it's not really about, getting Russia into your own alliance or geopolitical constellation because you like it, but it's more because you know what the impact would be if Russia joins the rivals bloc. But in reality, the dragon bear, the systemic coordination between China and Russia, has been completely, or let's say extensively, overlooked by the West over the last at least 7-8 years. Now it is a reality, and it is a reality that clearly bothers India. So India has this traditional strategic partnership with Russia, and Russia is currently navigating between this very complicated relationship between China and India. In a sense, it would rather take a mediator, will play a mediator's role in future tensions, which is, of course, not really a productive role, but in a sense will reach out to both and try to mitigate the tensions, try to diplomatically also mediate with both Beijing and New Delhi. They have also something that is called RIC. This is basically a format between Russia, India, and China at the level of foreign ministers. But clearly, Russia has the potential to get an access to the Indian Ocean. How? By a vertical expansion of geopolitical interests. When you see the map, you have to imagine that Russia's vertical expansion starts with the Arctic, moves from the Baltic Sea, from the north along the eastern flank of NATO. That means also Central Asia, Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, Black Sea, Mediterranean now with the access also to the Middle East. And now it is moving towards eastern coasts of Africa. So Russia is in fact seeking to build military bases and presence in already 6 African countries: Mozambique, Sudan, Madagascar, Eritrea, Egypt. This will give Russia leverage and also a direct access, maritime access to the Indian Ocean. And it is in fact in the interests of New Delhi to have a stronger Russia's role in the Indo-Pacific, because the foreign minister of Russia and also the political elite is very clear on the current definition of the Indo-Pacific and also the so-called Quad formation. In a sense, they see all of these initiatives and definitions as clearly US-led ones. And thus, I think that India seeks also to get Russia to have stronger role in the region, in a sense to also counterbalance China a little bit. That is really a very short, superficial overview regarding the lack of time.
Thank you, Velina. I know it's a tough one to answer quickly. Malcolm, please.
Thanks, Alica. I'll answer the first question on France. I didn't quite catch the second one because you faded out, but we'll come back to that. In terms of France's relationship with Australia and its role in the Indo-Pacific, obviously we want France to be an Indo-Pacific power. The way that the deal with Naval Group over the attack class submarines has been managed, I think it's been managed badly on both sides. Certainly we should have been far more diplomatic and careful in our approach on how we terminated that contract. But the way the contract was designed, there were gateways within the contract that allowed us to withdraw if we were not happy with how the contract was going. And that's what we did, especially when we were offered the opportunity to get nuclear-powered submarines as opposed to conventional-powered submarines. So we've both badly handled this. And like any breakup, there'll be a cooling off period where we probably won't be speaking to one another. But we would certainly encourage the opportunity to sit down with the French, to talk to them and build that relationship up again, because we do want France to be an Indo-Pacific power. It's in our interests, it's in their interests. They have too many interests in this region not to become an Indo-Pacific power. So certainly, defense spending needs to happen, but it needs to happen at the right time. Now, Alica, that second question, I didn't catch it, I'm sorry.
Second question was whether you think that Australia's alignment with the United Kingdom could foster Hwee's idea from her presentation on EU ASEAN reinforcing an inclusive multilateral framework, whether they can reinforce one another.
Yeah, I think it can. I do not think that AUKUS has to exclude other relationships in the region, particularly with ASEAN. We want AUKUS to be accepted and embraced by ASEAN. That's really critical. And so, like with the French, we do have to talk to the ASEAN states and actually sit down with them and explain why we're doing this and work out how we can take them with us. And that includes taking their interests into account as well. So this is a process of diplomacy that will occur in coming months and years, and it's really critical that we do that. But we have done it because we see a real challenge emerging from China, which we cannot ignore. And we do not believe that you can balance somehow a relationship between the United States and a relationship between China. That's no longer possible because of China's actions. So we did need to make that fundamental strategic choice, and that's what we've done.
Thank you, Malcolm. And the final words from Richard Lum. We won't have time for burning questions from the audience, but you can always contact the speakers.
Yes, and if I could, Patrick's wonderful comment about maps, that was great. And in fact, if anybody's curious, The most accurate map of the world is the one that features Hawaii as the center, because we are, but we can talk about that later. To the question about the presence of states in conflicts other than the ones that are involved, I think two of the big reasons that I think are driving why additional states are now becoming increasingly involved in conflicts around the world. One, I think, is just a consequence of decades of rising economic development, coupled with the new technologies, so that the capabilities to become involved, the capabilities to play a meaningful role, and to help determine outcomes in these things has frankly just gotten more accessible and affordable to more actors. So I think that's one of the big reasons why. And I think the other big reason is that the nature of our world today for all of us, our relationships, our interactions, we are much more interdependent. Whether you're talking about identities or ideologies or economic interests or political relationships, I think the web of relationships across communities and populations and leaders has just gotten that much more complex. And so I think you're going to find increasingly more newer actors finding a reason to get involved more and more in more of these conflicts. And those would be, I think, two of the big reasons I would throw out first.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks everyone. This was very, I think, good discussion and also remarks, and many people online watching this. I want to thank everyone, and please beware, everybody's bio is on the website, so you can contact the speakers. And myself too. My name is Alica Kizeková, and I'm the head of Asia-Pacific Unit at the Institute of International Relations in Prague. And we will continue monitor this particular sphere more closely as we progress. So enjoy the rest of symposium. We have a very short break of 5 minutes, and then we'll have a book launch discussion with connection from Japan, from Michito. So he's already online, but we'll take 5 minutes. Thank you.